For episode 23 of Apothecary Diary, unfortunately there isn't too much cultural things that we haven't talked about. We've already touched on how courtesans or prostitutes were looked down upon by society. And we've talked about the author's misidentification of a certain flower as cat's foot just last episode. So what I'd like to focus on this episode is about the two kinds of board games that are talked about in the episode. So they're the Chinese chess or xiangqi or Go or weiqi. Now let's just get this part clear. Mao's dad is actually better at the Chinese chess compared to Go, where her mom's actually better at Go. So when they actually did it to produce Mao, Lacan was actually given a choice as to which game to play. And he actually chose the one that he's not as good at. In that sense, he's actually giving her the choice rather than choosing himself. So that's the tiny bit of detail that some people might have missed. But let's just dive in and talk about the two games in particular. Because if you understand the games a little bit better, you might be able to pinpoint how they actually reflect each person's personality. Let's start with Chinese chess. Chinese chess originated probably around 3rd to 5th century AD. And there are two theories as to where it actually originated. Either in China endemically or potentially spread over to China from Silk Road, from somewhere in maybe Central Asia. Both theories had some proof and credence to it. The reality might be somewhere in between, where they originally had a game that's similar and got influenced by this game that spread over from Central Asia. In particularly similar to Western chess, Chinese chess are also played on a grid board. However, first of all, the pieces almost look identical except for the characters that are written on it. Those characters are how you tell each piece apart from another piece. Basically, they're spread into two sets. Rather than black and white, it's black and red. And in some sense, in order to accommodate people who are colorblind, specific characters are different between the sets. So for the black sets, you have a commander, and then two guards, and then two elephants actually. And then beside the elephant, you have two horses. And at the very side, you have two chariots. In front, you have two cannons. Although cannons that use gunpowder was invented much later on, the same character was actually used for catapults or trebuchet. So essentially, those characters. In front of the line, you have your soldiers, and then the red side will have different characters. For example, the black commander is usually written as general, whereas the red commander is actually marshal, so it's two different characters. So even if you're red colorblind, if you only see gray, you can still tell them apart. Guards usually were given a side character rather than straight up guard. And as the other side had elephant, this side actually has prime minister or advisor, but they're equivalent, they're only written differently. Horses on this side will also be written a little bit different, as well as chariots. And since the other side had cannons that are essentially trebuchets, these cannons on this side actually are fire cannons. They might not be gunpowder units, but something like fire trebuchet and so on, so they're also written differently. Even the soldiers from the other side and this side are written differently. One is written closer to soldier and one's closer to troop. So you can tell the two sets apart, even though they look identical except for the words written on it, even though if you can't see the color difference. But they are also color-coded, red and black. In terms of how pieces move, they're actually not placed inside the squares, unlike Western chess. They're placed on the cross-section of grids. And both commander and the guard, which interestingly enough, Lacan actually sees Jinshi as a guard piece. But both of them were restricted to this 9-point grid inside small area. They can't leave this area, they can only move around in this small area. Guards can only go diagonal within this area, whereas the commander piece can only go front and back and left and right. And then the piece beside it, which Lacan actually sees Gaoshen at, goes diagonal but only at 2 square increment. So they go 2 square diagonal. And they also have some restrictions. Although they're not restricted inside this one small area, there's a boundary on the board where they couldn't cross. Then you move on to the two horses, which essentially plays almost the same as knights in Western chess. The only difference is, since they're placed on the grid, they actually go one square to left and right and two square diagonal. So their range is a little bit smaller than the bishop, but they can cross a boundary in between. And then you move on to the chariot, which plays almost exactly like a rook. They go front and back and side to side with no restriction. And then in the very front, you have your soldier pieces, which are essentially equivalent to pawns, but they cannot go sideways before they cross the border. And once they cross the border, they can go sideways. Unlike Western chess, they can't go diagonal. They can take pieces in front and on the side, but no diagonal. And they don't change into other pieces, even though if they go to the bottom. And the only piece that's very different from Western chess is this cannon piece. They can go similarly to the chariots, but they can only take a piece when they're not directly in front of the piece. They have to have another piece in between them and take the piece behind it. So that's essentially how you play, and your goal is obviously to take out the commander. And besides regularly taking out the commander with your other pieces, there's also another way where if your commander has nothing blocking it in the direct path, the other commander cannot move into the sight of this commander. If you do that, then you lose. And if you check and force someone to be in that situation where they have to move that, then they lost. That's basically how Chinese chess plays. Now, unlike Chinese chess, Go is for sure invented in China. Comparatively, this is much older. Go was invented somewhere between 15th century BC all the way to probably 23rd century BC, so more than 4,000 years of history behind this game. It's also played on the grid, but the grid is much more numerous and there's no special features on the grid. It's essentially just a full grid. And pieces are also placed on the cross-section of the grid, not inside the square. Unlike a lot of other games, pieces in Go are identical to one another. There's no difference, except for the fact that each person will either use a black piece or a white piece. All of them look like round stones, so you don't even have to get a proper set. You can just choose rocks on the ground that look vaguely similar to one another and get a set yourself that way. The ultimate goal of Go is actually to surround your enemy, take their pieces, while not get surrounded yourself. In terms of playstyle, it's actually much more abstract from either like Chinese chess or chess in general. For the longest time, with the modern advancement in computing, compared to chess, people actually had a worse time designing AI that actually were good at Go. So in terms of computation and prediction and so on, this game is much harder. However, a few years ago, with advancement in AI, they have better Go-playing robots that are harder to beat by human players now. But that's only a pretty modern invention. So by comparison, between chess and Go, Go is much more abstract and requires a lot more abstract thinking, whereas Chinese chess is more strategizing. So the fact that Lacan is better at Chinese chess fits his personality pretty well. He also discussed how by doing his job, he essentially just sees everyone as chess pieces and just moves them around. The fact that he's better at it just means he's also good at his job as a commander of the army. Whereas Go, you need a lot more abstract strategizing because each piece is identical, you can't really see the difference. Therefore, you plan everything out in that manner. It's interesting that Mao's mom actually is better at it. We also see that she might have planned everything out pretty thoroughly and was expecting that. The very fact that she ended up the position that she is was that her planning and her preparations kind of just fell apart. And there's a tragedy right there in the story that she actually planned everything out very strategically, more so than like Lacan could ever do, but it somehow just fell into pieces where to a person like her, who generally give off the vibe of someone who's very confident, and because of her ability to play this game, people would most likely assume that she's good at strategizing. But the fact that people who are good at strategizing and confident can see their whole planning and the whole planning process fall apart, that usually hits them much harder than people who don't really strategize. So the kind of mental breakdown eventually, coupled with syphilis, basically gave us everything that she did up to this point. But just knowing that these kind of games do require a lot of mental math, mental thinking, and we kind of see why. And tragic story aside, this reflects their personality, of which the flower that represents Momo's mom, which was the balsam, also reflects personality in one sense. Balsam flower is used for dyeing fingernails, sure, but it also has this particular seed pod, where if you touch it, it blows up. Kind of like her whole storyline, where she's a good planner, she actually planned everything out, but when things fall apart, it kind of is hard for her to handle it. Now, there's not a good, Japanese anime about Chinese chess, because after all, it's a very restricted, Chinese game. There's some Chinese animation about it, none of them are very good, unfortunately, unlike Go, where you actually have a pretty decent amount of both anime and Chinese animation that are about Go that are actually not that bad. As I recommended last episode, you can give them a watch, especially the Japanese one, which is a classic called Hikaru no Go. If you're interested in this game in particular, give it a watch. And we're moving on to the last episode, next episode. We'll see what goes on there if there's anything more cultural to talk about. But overall, I hope you guys enjoy this anime in general, and I hope my kind of info actually help you a little bit when enjoying a little bit more. I hope it's not too convoluted that you didn't understand how these two kind of games work. If you know a little bit better, you can basically tell their personality a bit better based on the game that they like to play. I'd like to apologize for the later release of this episode, but I just had to go through and do a little bit of reminder research on these two games because I haven't played them in quite a while and I'm not particularly good at it. But just as I was editing this video, we have a news and new PV dropped confirming the second season of this anime is actually greenlit and in production. And it's scheduled to release next year, 2025. So I know it's almost a year away, but at least if it's greenlit, it's in production, we have something to look for after the season ends next episode. So hopefully that's a helpful news to you guys if you actually like the show and is wondering if there's more to come. Which there is more to come. We just got the news today.